Like the tree of Psalm 1:3, which is firmly planted by streams of water, the roots of Central Baptist Church extend back to a small community of believers in Dalarna, Sweden. Revivals in the 40s and the 50s brought many to Christ, but the state Lutheran Church feared the establishment of other denominations. Select groups called readers quietly practiced their faith and suffered fines and imprisonment. Available land was scarce in Sweden. Food shortages in the late 1860s and the lack of economic opportunity caused some people to focus on news from America. For many, jobs, land, and the freedom to worship were incentives they needed to put their faith into action and move from their beloved homeland. Meanwhile, Theophile Rougier, the first white settler in the area, now known as Sioux City, established a permanent dwelling on the east bank of the Missouri River in 1849. He was soon joined by others. Dr. John Cook, a civil engineer, platted this spot of wilderness into city blocks with streets and alleys during the winter of 1854 to 1855. The first steamboat arrived in June of 1856, and by the end of that year, there were about 150 inhabitants. In 1857, Sioux City was officially incorporated with 400 people and residents. The first Swede to come to Woodbury County was Niles Olson Stenbeck, a grading contractor, along with his wife and 4 children. They came in 1867, just 2 years after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The next year, the railroad came, and by now there were 3,600 people in Sioux City. 2 years later, visiting missionaries and pastors were able to gather as many as 300 Swedish-speaking people of various denominations at a single service. 8 of those had come from Genef, Dalarna, Sweden, and were the founders of our church. These pioneers formally organized the first Swedish Baptist church on January 17, 1874, 2 years before Custer's last stand. By the end of 1874, there were 17 members. M. Dahlberg served as a leader of this body, which occasionally met at the First Baptist Church. In 1879, after renting a hall on 6th and Pearl for $6 a month, the Swedish Baptist Church agreed with the Mission Society, later called the Covenant Church, to jointly build a church between 6th and 7th on Court Street. They alternated Sunday morning and evening services. In 1881, the church was incorporated under Iowa law, and they called their first pastor from the Swedish Baptist Seminary in Chicago, Reverend Schulin. In 1883, they called Reverend Halverson. He was connected with Bethel College. There were 10 saved that summer, and Sunday school was organized and started. People were coming to Christ and being added to the congregation. In 1884, the Baptists sold the interest in the building to the Mission Society for $1,900 and bought a lot at 10th and Virginia for $600. With winter coming, the congregation worked together to finish the basement by December. Reverend Alstrom received a call to come to this church in 1886. Its membership was 24 persons. Staggering, unpaid bills of $500 and a mortgage of $1,000 with 10% interest payable quarterly was a challenge for this dedicated man of God. Reverend Alstrom recalled, however, that things aren't always what they seem. He shared that lesson in a letter he wrote later for the congregation's Golden Jubilee. He said, quote, "A friend on the west side who managed the paint factory promised all the paint we needed for 2 coats for the church if I could come and take it away. I didn't go on the same day the offer was made. 2 days later, the factory was closed by creditors. I learned the lesson, but got no paint. These 24 members finished the church inside and out and paid off almost all the debt. Attendance was small, but a large number of children attended Sunday school, making many new friends in the neighborhood. This led to increasing numbers coming and several being baptized. The church had the distinction of being the first among the Swedish Baptist churches to have a church paper, the Harbinger of Peace, 4 columns, 4 pages, edited and published by the pastor. The first issue was published in December of 1887. This was an era of intense optimism in Sioux City, a time of extravagant corn palaces, a booming population, and a new railroad bridge connecting us to Nebraska, pointed towards unlimited economic growth. In 1890, the population of Sioux City had grown to 20,000, and the membership of the church was between 50 to 60. The worship center held 150 people and was usually at capacity for both morning and evening services. Pastor Nels Nelson served from December of 1898 to May of 1901. He remarked that 1900 was the best year. 30 people joined the church, 25 by baptism. They improved the building and paid off the mortgage. As the congregation grew and the local economy improved once more, Reverend Almquist was called from Arthur, Iowa in 1901. The burden for a new building to accommodate the growing congregation was again heavy on everyone. Pastor Almquist personally visited churches in Iowa, South Dakota, and Minnesota to solicit funds for a new church. In the spring of 1904, the old church was sold to the Augustana Lutheran Church and moved to West 5th and George Street. During the time the church was being built, members met in the courthouse. The cornerstone was laid on May 22nd, 1904, and construction on the new First Swedish Baptist Church at 10th and Virginia was completed later that year for $12,000. This same year, Sioux City experienced the worst fire in history, destroying several blocks of businesses. The following year, they completed the parsonage. The facility was dedicated in October of 1905. Pastor Johansson served from 1905 to 1912. During this time, 90 members were added. In 1910, Sioux City had a population of 47,000 and was the second largest city in the state of Iowa. Pastor Bennett Erickson served from 1912 to 1916. On Thanksgiving Day, the mortgage was paid off and joyfully burned.
Ni var döda genom era överträdelser och synder, den gång ni levde i dem.
During World War I, a law was passed prohibiting public meetings from being conducted in a foreign language. The church struggled with this restriction since the pastor struggled to speak English, but they complied. Under Reverend Nelson's ministry in 1920, the morning service reverted back to Swedish. Pastor Johnson served from June 1921 to November 1925. During his time, the church celebrated its Golden Jubilee in 1924. The Swedish service was again discontinued at this time, and the church's name was changed to Central Baptist Church to reflect its wider membership. Packing plants sprung up, and with the Roaring '20s came a massive immigration to Sioux City, pushing the population to 71,000. The stock market crash in 1929, followed by the Dirty 30s, heralded a grim end to this renewed economy. Haddon Klingberg was called to our church in 1932. He was instrumental in establishing the Iowa Baptist Young People's Union, the weekly radio broadcast over KSCJ, and the daily Vacation Bible School in 1939. In 1939, Central called Pastor Theodore Nelson. He had a heart for missions and shared his vision beyond Siouxland. Our young people began enrolling in Christian colleges. After World War II, Reverend Earl Sherman was called to be pastor in 1947. Under his leadership, a unified budget was begun. Buses were rented to pick up Sunday school pupils, and the parsonage was converted into classrooms. In 1948, Alan and Genevieve Swenson were sent out as missionaries with SIM. They were pioneer missionaries in the 1040 window while serving in Burkina Faso in West Africa. They spent 50 plus years serving and translating many books of the Bible into the language of the people. As the 75th year of the church was drawing near, Reverend Bronley Wee led the church to add a 2-story annex to the building. It was completed with much help from the men of the church. They established a church camp near Stone Park. Satellite Sunday schools and Bible studies were begun in other areas of town. The church remained strong through the 1950s as the polio epidemic rocked the nation, and Sioux City was impacted by the Missouri River flood in 1952. And the next year, the Floyd River flooded, causing the death of 14 people. In the 1960s, Reverend James Brigger Sr. served the church. Personal evangelism was one of the outstanding emphasis of his ministry. In 1962, Sioux City was named an All-American City and had a population of 89,000. In the fall of 1969, we adopted the Faith Promise program for missions. Faith promises made at that time amounted to $10,238 and grew to nearly $200,000 by the early 80s. With the sale of a small chapel on the west side for $600 and the growing congregation, it was decided that this money would be a good beginning for a building fund. Under Pastor Brigger, 2 fundraising campaigns were conducted to provide money for a new church facility. 4.5 acres on Pawnee Place were purchased for $25,000. When building began on the church, we had over $101,000 from those campaigns and the sale of other various properties. We borrowed $197,000 and the church was built for $300,000. On November 1st, 1970, Dr. Martin Stuck and his family arrived from California to take over pastoral duties. The first service at 3222 Pawnee Place was on January 31st, 1971. The 10th and Virginia property was leased to a new Assembly of God church for a year and then sold to them for $18,000 in 1972. Under Dr. Martin Stuck, many improvements to the building and property were made to accommodate the ever-increasing ministries of Central. On January 17, 1974, the congregation rejoiced as they celebrated 100 years of service to the Lord. In the late 1970s, the church leadership determined that a new location for Central was needed due to the lack of Sunday school classrooms and church parking. In 1982, to alleviate some of the overcrowding, the church purchased 2 portable classroom buildings. The church was considering a 39-acre tract of land for $210,000 when Dr. Mark Bubeck accepted the call to become Central's pastor in 1981. This property was purchased by the action of the church body on July 8, 1982. Dr. Bubeck was an author and a speaker. He brought Gladys Gleason in as a first secretary, and he created the children's coordinator position, which Mary Onan served in. Mary started the Awana program. Committees were formed to prepare once again to build and finance a new building that would more adequately serve the many ministries that Central developed and promoted over the previous 115 years. A stewardship enrichment program was entered into in 1984 to raise funds for a new and larger church building to meet the ever-increasing needs of a church committed to winning souls for Jesus Christ. That program raised $750,000. They sought God's will on how to use the funds. First, the mortgage on the Pawnee property was paid off and burned in 1986. Then, as the congregation increasingly answered the challenge to support foreign missions, they adopted a sister church in Romania. In the spirit of sacrifice, $35,000 of the funds raised towards a new building was sent to help the Romanian Christians. The church began reaching out to the hearing impaired with signing at the 9:30 services. Over the years, our youth program has grown, and some interns helped with the added burden, including current missionary Fred Young. In 1985, Brian Float, another of our current missionaries, was called to Central to lead our youth. Brian's vision for evangelizing the youth of Siouxland caused the establishment of Power Zone events, where up to 150 youth participated. Brian instilled deep commitments in our young people, leading them on mission trips as well as local mission projects. Dr. Bubeck was sensing the call to go into full-time ministry with International Center for Biblical Counseling, and he resigned in 1990. 1 year later, Dr. Tim Blanchard came to be our senior pastor. The need to build a larger facility was being felt more and more. In 1993, the decision was made to build our current building and celebrated it with a groundbreaking ceremony. On Christmas Day, 1994, the first service was held in its current location. By the grace of God, we were able to pay off the mortgage for this property in 2006 and burned it during a worship service. During Dr. Blanchard's time here, Pastor Bob Myers served as our worship pastor and led 8 years of the Living Christmas Tree performances from 1998 to 2005. He received great help and participation from so many in our church body. After Dr. Blanchard retired in 2007, Pastor Lloyd Grant answered the call to be our senior pastor in April of 2008. He became Dr. Grant in May of 2012. In July of 2016, the gasket on the main water pipe broke overnight and flooded the worship center and much of the main floor with 80,000 gallons of water. Thanks to great volunteers, we were able to get the water out and start drying things up. Following the flood, we met at North High School for 8 weeks and then started meeting in our activity center with multiple services. We worked with insurance and contractors to restore most of the first floor and renovate the worship center to what it is now. The first service held in the renovated worship center was on February 12, 2017. We are blessed by our rich history and are so humbled to have been able to serve the Siouxland community for 150 years.